Hello, P Street people, and whoever else might be joining us as this goes live, or maybe you're watching a recording at some point. Trying to make these things available at 6 o'clock on Sunday nights. Last week didn't go as planned. I don't think I got it uploaded till around 10:15, and that was due to kind of a perfect storm. But it was there for some of you maybe getting up on Monday or coming in Monday night. But we want to do part 2 of our series, The Rest of His Story, and we're calling this particular installment BC. When most people think of Jesus' story, or the story of Jesus, or the narrative of Jesus, most people instinctively think about his birth. They think about his ministry. They think about his death and his resurrection, and that makes total sense, right? I mean, those are such vital, important truths and chapters, as it were, in Jesus' story. But what we're looking at is the fact that Jesus' story involves more than even those things. And if we have an understanding and appreciation of some of the other parts of Jesus' story, the rest of his story, then that can kind of broaden our perspective on his life, can enrich our appreciation for who he is and what he accomplished on our behalf. We kind of illustrated it this way. We got Jesus' birth on one end, we got his death, burial, and resurrection on the other. But we're kind of concerned about what's going on before his birth and what's going on after his death, burial, and resurrection. Okay, and so last week, of course, we looked at John 1 through 3, and that's where John shares with us 4 big things about Jesus' story. The first one is that, whenever the beginning arrived, when the beginning of the world arrived, Jesus is already there. He existed in the beginning. And not only that, but he existed in the closest possible relationship with God the Father. Now, he wasn't himself the Father. He was distinct from the Father, but he was God. Jesus, the Word, was in fact God. And not only that, he did what God can do, and that's create. He was involved in the creation of everything. And we drew some implications from that. We said, not only did he not have to die, he didn't even have to be born. And then we go, well, why did he come here? Why did he volunteer to do that? And why did he volunteer to die on a Roman cross? And of course, we're left astounded by the answer, and that is because he loved us. And what we want to do is we want to pick up kind of with creation and going to Jesus' incarnation. And that's why we're calling this lesson BC, because there's evidence that there is a chapter to Jesus' story that we find in between creation and incarnation. Now there are a lot of stories in the Old Testament that folks will take you to, and they will say, hey, here is an example of Jesus' involvement before his incarnation, Jesus' involvement in creation before his incarnation. Some people will take you to Genesis 18, where those three beings, appeared as humans, approach Abraham, and some say, hey, the one in the middle, that was Jesus. Some folks will take you to Genesis 32, and where Jacob is wrestling this angel, this seemingly God, and some say he was wrestling Jesus. He was wrestling the second person of the Trinity there. Not a few will take you to Joshua 5:13 through 15, where you have this, sort of captain of the Lord's army, of the Lord's hosts, that appears to Joshua, and that Joshua is reminded, hey, you're standing on some holy ground here, and folks say, hey, that right there, that's most definitely Jesus. Then there's the references to the angel of the Lord. You'll find that in the story of Gideon. But the angel of the Lord pops up well before that, back in the story of Moses. And a lot of people make, some arguments that that's not God the Father, that's essentially God the Son, that's Jesus. And then, of course, when it comes to the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you got them going into the furnace, and one like a son of man pops up there in the midst of them. It's like there's a fourth guy in there. Who is that? Well, not a few folks have suggested that's Jesus. Maybe. There's a lot of controversy here, a lot of debate about whether or not we can, beyond a shadow of a doubt, establish that these are sort of pre-incarnate appearances of Jesus in space and time. And so we're not gonna deal with those. We're gonna deal with a different passage, and that passage. And if you got your Bibles, or maybe you got a phone handy and you're watching this on TV or something, you can turn to 1 Corinthians 10. That's the passage that we're going to look at, specifically the first 4 verses. There's a statement in there that kind of piques your interest. It leaves you wanting more, a lot more. It'd be like going to your favorite restaurant, which in my case is Red Lobster. I am not ashamed to say that I love Red Lobster. Everything about it. Their cheddar cheese biscuits, the shrimp scampi. This passage, 1 Corinthians 10, would be like going to Red Lobster and getting one shrimp scampi to eat and having to leave. I was like, you got one, and that one would be good, but it's going to leave you wanting more. And 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 4 is kind of like that, because we're going to come across a statement here that leaves you wanting more. You're going to want to ask Paul, hey, could you pause there and elaborate on that a little bit more and talk a little bit more about what you just said there? It doesn't fully satisfy our curiosity, but I do think it tells us enough for us to conclude, whatever you might say about some of those other passages that we looked at, that Jesus was indeed involved with God's people prior to his incarnation, that the second person of the Trinity was not aloof from creation. Now, 1 Corinthians is a letter that is written to we might say, a troubled church. Okay, they had their problems, and 1 Corinthians 10 potentially shows us one thing that stood behind some of their problems. That was sort of some arrogance, some overconfidence, perhaps. There's an ever-present danger of looking at the blessings we've received from God, and rather than those blessings pushing us to be more devoted to God, we can become kind of arrogant and overconfident in our standing with Christ. And so our focus is going to be on the blessings of what Paul does in 1 Corinthians 10 is he takes you back to the wilderness generation. And he's going to share with us the blessings that wilderness generation received, much like the Corinthian churches, much like Pulaski Street's received. He's going to remind them of their blessings. He's going to remind the Corinthians of the blessings that the wilderness generation had, only to watch them fall, become disobedient. And it all kind of leads to this crescendo where Paul tells the Corinthians, take heed lest you fall, right? Don't take so much pride in these blessings that you forget that there's responsibility that is bound up with those blessings. But it's in the midst of kind of discussing the blessings that the wilderness generation received that statement, that fascinating statement, is made by Paul. So let's just look here. This is the first 3.5 verses from 1 Corinthians 10. Let's just kind of walk through this and chart some of the blessings that this desert generation received. So in verse 1 he says, "For I want you to know, brothers," and the brothers here is the Corinthian church, "that our fathers were all under the cloud." So Paul talks about that cloud, that visible representation of God's presence among them. You can read about that in Exodus 40, verses 34 through 38. That cloud that was among them, and in the midst of them, it guided them. This refers to the blessing of guidance that God gave this desert generation. You know, whenever that cloud went, or wherever that cloud went, they went. And God guided them here and there. And then the text says, "And they all passed through the sea." Well, this refers to the great blessing of deliverance, right, that God gave them. They walked through the parted waters of the Red Sea on dry land, and they witnessed the destruction of the Egyptians that were pursuing them. God gave them guidance with the cloud. God gave them deliverance through the sea. And then at this point, I think Paul makes a connection, using language here, between the desert generation's story and the Corinthians here. And all were baptized, Paul writes, into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Paul uses language that is not found in the Old Testament to describe these events. And I think he does that in order to make the connection more clear to these Corinthian Christians who had been baptized into Christ and had received that blessing. You know, Paul says that as they were in the cloud and in the sea, they were, as it were, baptized into Moses, you know, kind of coming under his leadership, just like Christian baptism, okay, puts us under the leadership of Jesus. And the desert generation was baptized into Moses, and they had guidance in the cloud. They had deliverance in the sea. But they also had another blessing, and Paul puts it like this: they all ate the same spiritual food. For those 40 years in the desert, God gave them supernatural food from heaven, right? Manna. And they'd get that food 6 days a week. Paul appears to be making a parallel here to the Corinthians' blessings of the Lord's Supper, right? How we all eat of the same bread. He's going to go on and talk about this for a little later in 1 Corinthians 10. And that bread represents Christ's body. And then Paul goes on to mention, right, that not only did God give them food, but he also gave them drink. And they all drank the same spiritual drink, just as we all share in the cup, which represents Christ's blood. Everyone in the desert generation drank the same spiritual drink. And then the text says, "For they drank from the spiritual rock." Now, there are 2 times that this drinking from a rock is described in the Old Testament. The first is Exodus 17, okay? And the children of Israel were thirsty, and they began to complain. And what I want you to note about, I'm going to bring this passage up here, what I want you to see is that this is like early on, right? And this is in the early days of the story of this wilderness generation, early on. So notice what we have here. So all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore, the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So they're upset, and they're doing kind of what we've seen them do before and we'll see them do again. They're murmuring, they're grumbling against Moses, ultimately against God. So here's where the response comes in. So Moses cried to the Lord, what shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me. I mean, they're ready to take me out and go back to Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Egypt. So here's the first time near the beginning of their journey. Near the beginning of their, this is right on the heels essentially of the Exodus out of Egypt. And this is where they received water from the rock. At least it's recorded for us the first time. But then there's a second time, and this is toward the end of their wandering. Okay? So we got an instance to start, and we got an instance towards the end. And you'll find this in Numbers chapter 20. So let me bring that up. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into the wilderness, that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. There's still, even after all this time has passed, even after God has proven himself again, they are complaining. Where's the water? So here we go. Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they fell on their faces. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them, and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Now notice, incidentally, here, God commands Moses to speak to the rock. He does not command Moses to strike the rock. Notice what happens. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me to hold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I've given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy. There's a lot in there that we could unpack. I just want you to see that these are the two times where we get this story of Egypt grumbling about no water. On both occasions, God provides them with water. Interestingly, on the second occasion, God still graciously provides them with water, even though Moses disobeyed him and didn't do what God asked him to do in the matter of the rock. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. Based on these two examples in Exodus 17 and Numbers 20, there was a rabbinic tradition among the Jews that said that there was this stream of water, or a rock even, that physically went with the desert generation through those 40 years. Now understand what they're saying, that there was like this rock or whatever stream, a source of water that was just kind of making its way. As they moved, it moved. Okay? Now, there is no evidence of that in the Old Testament. Okay? What you've seen is all there is to see relative to the water and the drink from the rock, the reference I think that Paul is making. Having said that, though, it does appear as if maybe Paul was aware of this rabbinic tradition. And here's the statement. This is where the statement comes that is just full of intrigue. This is the one piece of shrimp scampi when you wish you wanted, wish you could have some more. Here's what the text says. It says, "For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." So there's some spiritualizing going on here. I mean, it didn't get called, it gets called the spiritual rock here, but the ESV's like, we're going to go ahead and capitalize that, because Paul's working up to make an interesting observation, right? I mean, I showed you the two passages where we get them drinking from a rock, but Paul's really onto something else here. And we're like, well, what does Paul mean by that? Does Paul mean that that it really wasn't a physical rock that, let's say, followed them, that was with them on those occasions, but that it was actually much more than a rock, that it was Jesus disguised as a rock? That before Jesus came as a man, Jesus came as a rock, that when, like when Moses hit the rock, he was hitting Jesus. I think that's pushing the language a bit too far to suggest that. And others would say, well, does he mean that just like that rock gave them blessings the blessings to that wilderness desert generation, then the thought is that Jesus gives us similar blessings today, spiritual blessings, as though the rock were a type of Christ. Christ is similar to the rock. What the rock did for them, for that desert generation, Christ does for the Corinthians or for his people today. I think the language that Paul uses here might be a little too strong for just making that interpretation or coming to that understanding. I think Paul's saying in essence that there was a rock that followed them. It wasn't a physical rock, because the rock that followed them was Christ. And Paul is suggesting here that Christ was the true source of their blessings. And just like Christ is the source of our blessings. I mean, even back then, even before he came to earth, even in that desert generation, Christ was involved in their lives. Christ was involved in that generation. Christ was the source of all these wonderful blessings that they received. He was there. He was present. And I would add to this that it's an interesting passage. I'm not going to bring it up and show you the passage, but take some time to study Jude 4 and 5. Easily dismissed by some. The ESV, instead of mentioning the Lord or Joshua there, actually uses the word Jesus, implying that Jesus was somehow involved in the exodus of this generation of Israelites. I think we have confirmation here in the New Testament that Jesus was in fact involved BC. So where does that leave us? I mean, what can we do with that information, and how does it help us? Here's I think a good statement that we'll spend just a little moment here elaborating on. We should not limit Christ's involvement on earth to those 30 plus years following his incarnation. And others, as I said, some of the passages I used earlier, some would say all of that's Jesus. Some would say none of that's Jesus. Wherever you come down on, the fiery furnace, the person in the fiery furnace, or the angel of the Lord, whatever. I think we have evidence in 1 Corinthians 10, not to mention a few other passages, that Christ was involved prior to his birth, okay, that he was involved with the Israelites to a greater or lesser extent. But here's, I think, something that we need to understand today, that just as Jesus was involved prior to his birth, Jesus remains involved after his resurrection. He is with us today. I mean, even though he is not with us in the flesh, okay? When he came in the flesh, that was God with us. That was Emmanuel. And he was with us in a special way. And that's where we often really focus, as we've said, on the story of Jesus, his birth and his life and his death, burial, and resurrection. But when he ascended back into heaven, when after his resurrection, his involvement with us, his care for us, his concern for us didn't dissipate or end or vanish. As we share the Lord's Supper, as we did this morning here at Pulaski Street, and as many of our brothers and sisters did worldwide, as we share in the Lord's Supper, we call that communion. It's not just a memorial. I mean, it is that. We do it in remembrance of him. But it's also communion, that we commune with each other, our brothers and sisters in Christ, but we also commune with Christ. Matthew 26:29, Jesus says, I tell you, I'll not drink it again of this fruit of the vine until the day that I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. There is this already not yet aspect to that. We commune with Christ in the Lord's Supper, and we're looking forward to that sort of marriage feast, right, in heaven. And we wait for that, but we in a sense feast with him now. It's a song that we sing from time to time. He joins us here. He breaks the bread. The Lord who pours the cup is risen from the dead. The one we love the most is now our gracious host. Come take the bread. Come drink the wine. Come share the Lord. Jesus is with us when we commune with him. Matthew 18:20. Text reads, For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. Do you believe that? Now let me say, contextually, this is not talking about worship. I mean, this has been used a lot in reference to worship, and maybe you can't say that Jesus isn't with 2 or 3 people that are worshiping, or just remains, I'm sorry, you're not a big enough group for me to be concerned with you. But contextually, this is talking about Christ being present when folks are dealing with an unrepentant sinner. Go read the context of this. And the 2 or 3 harkens back to witnesses in the Old Testament. You got 2 or 3 here that are in agreement that there is an individual who is refusing to repent, who is refusing to own up to their failure. And the idea is that if discipline must be exacted, so to speak, then it's like Christ is in the midst of them on that decision, and in a sense sanctions that decision. I'll be right there beside you, Christ says, when you have to make those difficult decisions. And then I think about just what Jesus said at the end of his, when he's given his Great Commission, the last words he gives those disciples, which I think still ring true for us, is, Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And when I consider that Christ is involved, even still, that he remains present, if we have eyes of faith, right, to see it, that can bring us joy. that can bring us peace, that can bring us strength in knowing, trusting that we are not alone. I mean, imagine if we really, 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 really believe that. Imagine what that would do for our church family, not just us personally. Imagine what that would do in terms of holiness, that Christ is present, to be conscious of Christ's awareness, to know that He's with me. I might not do some of the things that I do, right? And I might start doing some things that I should be doing. Imagine how that could ignite an evangelistic fervor and trusting and knowing that Christ is with us in difficult times and in not so difficult times. So it's interesting to think, right, that prior to even sort of stepping foot on this planet as a human, even though I know He came as a baby, okay, He was involved with creation. He was certainly interacting and involved with creation while He was here in the flesh. But please know, He didn't stop caring. He didn't stop being present after His resurrection. We'll continue our series next week as we'll take a look at that event that does happen a few weeks after His resurrection. It's known as the Ascension, and there are, I think, some interesting things for us to discuss and to think about relative to that time when Jesus just was lifted from the earth and went out of sight. It's incredible to think about, and we'll do that next week. Thanks for watching.